and taking the story of our research and education roles into the broader populace. So I always urge our faculty to take the presentations, the talks that they have done on their research at international conferences and present it to the local community as well. So this is an exercise in us practicing what we preach. As it says in the subtitle here, this is modified from 2 little 20-minute talks that Carla and I gave at the Society of Ethnobiology international meeting about a year ago in California. We're not going to the one this year, but that was a very stimulating group of people to interact with. So I'll kick off, if I can remember the procedure here. And we're onto the advanced slide mode. Is that turned on? Do I have to point at anything?
This should be okay now.
Okay. So the outline for the next 50 minutes or so is first a presentation by Carla in which she presents her analysis of plant product trade patterns amongst First Nations of northwestern BC, and points out some of their relationships to climate and biogeography, and speculates on some relationships and clues found within linguistics. I'll then take over with examples of our work in which we try to take lessons from traditional land management practices and apply them to current day sustainable forest management. And that focuses a lot around the area of management and sustaining the yield of multiple values in host territories or trap lines or watersheds. And then in closing, I hope you'll agree with us that ethnobiology is a very interdisciplinary field relevant to many modern problems. So the Venn diagram that's been flashing up and down here shows the traditional perspective of the ethnobiology, ethnobotany fields as that intersection of biology or ecology with history and anthropological research, and with a fair amount of linguistics and language work involved too, because in many cases it's the naming of plants and practices that hold a lot of clues to the culture and to their management. And we'll just touch on that briefly. This historical photo shows someone trekking on one of the grease trails, which Carla will now discuss. But again, keep in mind throughout these little presentations, the theme, see if you see it like we do, that this combination of local sustainability coupled with trading with your neighbors really is a pervasive theme, a key to resilience of communities. Carla, you're up next.
So I advance with that. Okay. Hello everybody, thank you for coming. How lovely to see you. And we acknowledge and thank the Tsimshian Nation for allowing us to present on their traditional territory. So this is part of the research I did for my PhD, and I was kind of struck by, I met with many elders in the Niska, with the Niska First Nation, and I was really struck by how much people talked about trade with Gigsan and with Tsimshian and with the Tlingit and Haida people. It was really a theme that people talked about a lot, and I started to notice, one elder would say something like, oh yeah, in the spring, and this is a really good time to be giving this talk because as you all know, the Ulukans are running right now, which is of huge importance in the Nass and for other communities, and that's when a lot of the trade traditionally would have happened. So I think this is a good time for this talk. So what people would say to me, is that the Gigsan would come because they had lots of berries, and so they would bring berries and trade for Ulukans. And then people would go on the grease trails. I've been sort of fascinated by the grease trails. I had one picture where, I can't find it, unfortunately. I never nabbed it when I got it. I was doing archival research, and there was a picture of a man walking up the grease trail between heading towards the Hazeltons, and the trail had been used for so many hundreds of years that it was worn this deep into the ground. It was just a striking photograph to outline how long people have traded and the importance of trade to First Nations and sustaining themselves and their cultures and the interaction between cultures. So that's the long. So yeah, just what I was saying basically, it's a long history for trade of plant and animal products. Like the interior nations would have probably had more access to certain animals and traded for furs, whereas on the coast it would have been salmon and things that were traded. And the trade was based on the distribution of species and the ability to get it quickly on your territory and the abundance. And you know, today there's still similar trade. I still have a friend, my friend Irene Sagan from the NAS, who every year after they make oolakan grease, she heads up to Alaska and trades for seaweed. I mean, so it's still happening today that people are doing that. And I think it will continue into the future, especially as we begin to realize the importance of local sustainability and local foods. So this case study, it involves this area here, so the Niska, Gitxsan, Tsimshian, Haisla, Wet'suwet'en, and bordering a little bit over into the Tahltan and the Haida. But the nations that I concentrated on the most were the Niska, Gitxsan, Tsimshian, and Haida, and Wet'suwet'en, not so much. And that's from my thesis, Using Plants the Niska Way, which is actually titled in Niska, but I don't have it up here because I probably couldn't do it justice if I tried to say it. So within each territory, and territories were always changing hands culturally for hundreds of years for different reasons. Boundaries would shift just much the way they do today. But for most nations, most of their needs were met by resources within their territory, and also met by pretty annual gatherings with other nations where you discussed and traded products and arranged marriages and whatnot. So there was lots of interplay between the cultures. But some valued resources are restricted or more abundant in different ecological zones. And this is a really cool old photograph, and if you can imagine in your mind right now, this is going on in the Nass right now. The fish are out, and people are so excited. One of the greatest joys I had was doing my research. I got to spend 10 days at an oolakan camp when people were oolakan fishing and got to just take part in all the traditions and see things. So this is a picture from very long ago when people were actually fishing through the ice, and about 4 or 5 years ago, for the first time in 35 years, they had to do that again. So oolakans are highly desired food, and those are the different places, coastal places where you would have harvested oolakan. The Niska believe that the Nass River has the best abundance of oolakan, but I think Skeena River people also think there are lots on the Skeena. So there is a fair bit of trade. And the oolakans are harvested and then dried in bins, huge bins. It's an amazing number of fish and covered with certain plant products. But it was a real important trade product. So not a plant product, which is my specialty, but traded for plant products. So here's a network of the grease trails, and called the grease trails because of oolakan grease, I expect. And then I think when European contact first happened, they changed it to another name. But really, these trails were in existence far before contact. And much like today's highways, but in a much more difficult way. People traveled by foot and carried heavy loads on their back and knew their trails and how to survive. So it's a pretty impressive display and ability and knowledge of the land. So I'm just going to read this to you. I like doing it, but so this is from 1872. We met many of the Gitsigukla Indians returning from the great feast at Kitwamkul. More than 100 have passed us, and they were without a single exception, not only men, but women and children laden with large cedar boxes of the size and shape of tea chests. which were filled with the rendered grease of the candlefish caught in the Nass waters. So that's from 1872, so well over 100 years ago, and that had been going on for hundreds of years before that. I remember when I first started my research going through Hudson Bay journals and looking at the different entries from the Hudson's Bay Post people, so prior to that, how people were coming in to fish the Ulican and trade products. And there's a bentwood box. Typically those are the boxes that people would have carried in them, and those boxes, are made without nails or anything but steamed and bent. That belongs to my friend Irene, and it was passed on from her grandfather, who had it passed on to him. So a very old box. So, I'm saying that Ulican, and there's always the way people spell the common name in English changes all the time, and black huckleberry, which is more typically found at higher elevations, the Gigsan, and although it's found on the coast, but the interior nations at higher elevations would have had more access to it. And berry cakes and fish were very important storage products because once the seasons for hunting and collecting berries were over, people had learned how to store food and worked out ways of storing them and trading the goods that they need. So up at the top there you can see the Ulican bins and the drying of Ulicans, which will be either dried and stored or rendered into grease. And then the bottom picture there is somebody drying berries, and typically the soft berries like raspberries weren't usually stored for winter, but any of the vaccinium, the huckleberry or blueberry species, and soapberry and those kinds of berries were perfect for drying, and typically dried over fires, get harvested. Often the women would gather berries while the men went hunting in places, and they'd gather the berries and dry them on the spot to make berry cakes and to use as for fresh berries as well. And of course, typically they're jarred today, but in the past this was how it was done. So here are some of the things that people would have traded that were important products, like Taxus brevifolia or Western yew was a very important traditional medicine. Now it didn't grow or is very sparse in the Nass, so people would, and yet it's more abundant on Haida Gwaii. So often a trade of yew for medicines was done between the nations. And I think that for the Shimshan people, the Taxus would also grow on their territory, but they believed that the Taxus on Haida territory made better medicine. And I don't know, I mean, it would be an interesting research topic for someone to go and see if you found at certain elevations or in certain sizes made better medicine. I don't think anyone's done that. A huge and important plant today for many First Nations here, and showing a lot of potential for medicinal use, much like how Taxus has been developed in treatment of cancer, traditional use brought into use by the pharmaceutical industry to treat cancer. Devil's Club. In my work, I think of all the plants, people talked most about Devil's Club. Devil's Club, every person of all across the generation still knew of the plant and knew of its uses, and pretty interesting in a culture where people are just learning their language again, knew the name of it in their language, which is Wong. So still largely used and revered, but if you Google it, you'll see that at UBC they're doing a lot of research on Devil's Club, and it shows a lot of potential, much like Taxol, for treating various kinds of for treating a lot of infections, bacterial infections, and for treating different cancers like colon cancer and pancreatic cancer. So, it may be in 5 or 10 years we'll have some clinical trials of Devil's Club. But the other really important species still that everybody knew about was Shepherdea canadensis, or soapberry, and it's called is. It's still used and highly prized and valued as a feast food. I've been to many feasts in the Nass, and each time people it's just a big treat. You save the soapberry for the elders only, but everybody really wants to have it. You pick the berry and whip it up into a froth, and it's just this wonderful treat and way to end feasts. So those are three of the products that would have been traded, and basically this is just to lead into how I created what I'm going to show you next. I don't know how many of you know about the biogeoclimatic zones of British Columbia, but our province is divided up into different zones, and those zones, each one has a species that is more dominant on a particular site. And if you the biogeoclimatic zones, it's just an ecological classification of climax ecosystems, and they have things like there's IDF was the interior Douglas fir, or you'd have the MH mountain hemlock, so you would expect to find more mountain hemlock there. And it's a really useful way for us to interpret people's land use and the products that they found on their land. So not a system devised by First Nations, but one that's useful as we work together to understand how people lived off the land. So bio, living things, geo, the earth, and climate. So those three things taken into account to develop this map. And if you're interested more in that, I suggest you Google biogeoclimatic zones, and there's a really good explanation on it. It was developed by Vladimir Crane in the 1970s, and then the BC government now adopts it. So this is just for BC. Other provinces have other ways of showing and showing their province and its vegetation, but this is how we do it. And some of you may already know this, but I don't know if all of you do, so I thought I'd give a brief explanation. There's much more to it than that, and there are designs into subzones and micro. Anyway, just as long as biogeoclimatic zones was not devised by First Nations, it's considered by many. It's a useful tool and a way to standardize research and what you're looking for. And it's based on field analysis. People go out and look for plants. Anytime you gather a plant, you document where you found it, and that way we get to know what's growing where and where it is most abundant. So this is from my work, and this is a distribution map. I don't know if you can see those little black points, but those are the points where you would typically find soapberry. And I gathered all this information by going to the National Herbarium, the herbarium in British Columbia, my own research, and if you go into eFlora, all the different collections that they had. And I wish I could say that I made this beautiful map, but I didn't. But I had someone help me do the map and put the dots in place. So what you can clearly see from that is that soapberry is an interior species. So if you can find it on the coast, but you're not going to find it in abundance. So you can see why. Let's see if I know how to work this. The Gitxsan here, this is their territory, down into here, and the Wet'suwet'en would have had a really, really important trade product that they could bring along and give to people. And this is for Western Yew. Now I have a quote by an elder in the Nass saying that when his grandfather used to go collect yew, it was such an important species that he performed a sisatqu before he went. And sisatqu is a spiritual ceremony to help you find the plant and hope that you will be guided to this plant that's so useful, because it rarely is found in the Nass. And if you look at the dots there, you can see that there's an awful lot on Haida Gwaii, a little bit on Shimshan Tory. There's one little collection there in the Nass. So you can see why this would have been, aside from all the fish and things that the Haida had to trade, that yew would have been an important plant product. And when you traded the information about plants, people who were the people who treated you would also trade recipes. A lot of them are proprietary, but probably between healers they would have traded that knowledge as well. Now here's Devil's Club. Again, Devil's Club is one that is pretty widespread. So all nations had access to it, and it was used by everybody. It's a very important plant in the history of Devil's Club. There's a story going back 100 years or so, but that was passed down orally about the importance of Devil's Club. And you can see it grows everywhere, but there was still a trade from some people for different Devil's Club plants, because people like to have plants of a certain height and a certain diameter. It was believed that the plants that grew straight and tall and the ones that were an inch or so in diameter made the best medicine. And I tried to look into, see if there was any chemical basis for that belief, and nobody's really done that research, so it would be an interesting one. Or if it's a spiritual belief that something that's tall and straight and big makes the best medicine. I'm not really sure. But I know that certain people believe that they would like to get Devil's Club from one nation over another because they had better plants. So that was an item of important trade as well. And the other one, this black huckleberry again, I think I discussed that earlier, but you can see it's largely a high elevation species found in other areas as well, like the Shimshan. And obviously these dots don't represent every single place that you would find huckleberry, but you can still see that generally speaking, you would find it in here. And it was a hugely important item of trade for keeping people healthy. You had to have vitamin C stored and throughout the winter for your use, and so it was an important trade product. I also did a couple of more plants in this chapter and their distribution, but I'm not going to be presenting them here. But an interesting thing that I want to point out is that not only were the plants traded, and this is often how we make linguistic connections. Now, I'm not a linguist, and I don't know if any of you have ever worked with linguists, but they're pretty exacting people. But I've got assurance that you can see the Niska name, the Western Dixan, the Shimshan name for Devil's Club are very similar, and so that their languages are similar as well. But when you get to the Skidegate Haida and the Masset Haida, they have different names as well. Shaperdia, the same, just slightly different pronunciations. But the Haida, Tlingit, the Haida have the name at the back, for the Tlingit have a very similar word. So I would guess that the Haida and the Tlingit from the northern Haida traded names and soapberry because their plant names are so similar. The same with the Pacific Yew, that Hadakwa means strong bow actually in their language. But you can see this, the Skidegate Haida and the Masset Haida have a different word that they share, and probably because that was on their territory, they called it a similar thing. So it's a really interesting research to look in the naming of plants, and that's how you understand cultures and the importance of language is plant names. And not only did they trade products, but they traded names and other things. So obviously it wasn't just on the Northwest coast, which I'm talking about. Trade is huge and it's widespread, and lots of hubs of exchange, and people on the coast would have seashells and things for making baskets, and maybe in the interior there were more furs and dried fish, and people would have made pemmican from big animals that roamed their areas, obsidian and copper. So trade was an important way of life for all people living off the land. And there's evidence for long distance trade. This is, Phil, do you want to do this one for me? Because this is about the trade of...
I think it's just making the point on the bottom there that there's clearly maize or corn was transported from North America to South America and had to get over some distances, including the inhospitable Darien Gap, to do so.
And so, just further evidence that people moved products and they learned how to move products and use plants. So there was an exchange of culture and language there as well. And evidence of trade of tobacco. The Haida grew tobacco, but it likely originated from California. So it seems pretty likely to me, with all the skill and craftsmanship of the canoes that people were able to make, that moving things like tobacco and tobacco seeds up the coast to Haida was very likely. I haven't really found anywhere that says for sure that happened, but I think that it likely did. And that's an pretty old herbarium sample of Haida tobacco. I think it's from, do you know the date of that photo. It's very old, so it was a specimen from 75, 80 years ago or longer. They might have held potatoes as well as tobacco before European contact. It's typically thought that Europeans brought potatoes to people here on the coast, and you know, so that was like a really good thing that they did. But I didn't really want to think that myself, so I did a paper that I haven't published yet, looking at the trade of potato and how at first it actually, where it came from, but the Europeans took it over to Europe and then brought it back, and they're credited with bringing it to the Haida and other nations. But I did my paper looking at the possibility of the fact that people would have traded for potatoes before then, traded potatoes. And so around here, one of the names for potato is scuseed. And I had a linguist friend look at all the different words for potato. I actually put out a call in a linguistic website for anybody's name for potato in any culture, in any language. And this is the one that came up. The Quechua people had the name of asku or akshu for potato. And maybe there were intermediates on Mexico and the US coast. And that possibly it moved down. The Salish word for a potato is scouse or scouse, which you can see. Again, I'm not a linguist, but I've been assured that there is a linguistic connection. So it suggests to me that maybe people traded in potatoes before Europeans brought them back. The Salish people had that name. The Haida is scusi, and the Niska. So my point in showing this slide is there is a connection that suggests possibly there was trade for potato before European contact, and that fact people knew about potato ahead of time. Use of these botanical products continues through cash exchange, but also through barter and familial exchanges. Is one of the dear elders I worked with, Alice Azak, for many times in the NAS, and we were going out to collect Devil's Club, and she still makes Devil's Club medicine, and she'll exchange and trade it for things as well. I don't think she ever sells medicine. And there's some of the Devil's Club. She makes the medicine from the bark you scrape off the spines, and that's her medicine. And if you were to want to take it, you should never try to make your own and make the medicine on your own without consulting a knowledgeable person. She would tell you how to take that. And this is my friend Irene Sagan, and this is her Ulukan, and this was the time when I managed to spend time in the Ulukan camp, and I was just getting pictures and all the different plants they use. So that bin is absolutely full of Ulukans and covered with hemlock branches. And she still trades, as I said, for these things, for seaweed and other things. And so this is the Niska Highway going up to the Nass, and that actually, if you look at it, was originally part of the Grease Trail. So the Grease Trail now is a paved highway and people go up and down by car, but it still exists in a sense. And one of the things Phil and I always think we'd like to do is try and retrace some of the Grease Trails, go camping along them and see if we can find any of them. So I pass it on to you now. Oh no, this is ongoing subsistence use and commercial products. So these are some of the things that people are doing now in the modern day. Mushrooms were not traditionally used by First Nations people as food. There was one or two fungi, hard bracket fungi, that were used for medicines, but I've never been able to find anyone who said traditionally that they used mushrooms. But if you go into the farmer's market or anywhere, you'll see many products. There's devil's cup roots and other things, and I have a particular strong belief that whenever I see anyone selling this, I ask what their connection is and if they have permission to using and selling the product. And this young woman that had set up at the farmer's market in Prince George was a relative of a Haida woman, and it was her grandmother who was saying, yeah, it was okay to sell it. And I think that's an important thing to consider in terms of compensating First Nations for their knowledge. And this was a a co-op, the Whoopsamai Huckleberry Co-op, which Phil and I began with some Gixan people after we'd all worked on a project together to try and start a non-timber forest products co-op of local products. So unfortunately, we've never made it, but for about 5 years we made wild huckleberry jam with people in the Gixan territory, and people often ask us if we'll start again, but at that time people weren't willing to pay extra money for local foods. So this was in the late 1990s. Wild rice too. This one of the things you have to think about when commercial trade in wild plants. The wild rice harvested in Manitoba and in Minnesota and Wisconsin is a very important plant for people in terms of their economy, and what frequently happens is big business will move in and patent things, and there was a big firm in California that got some of the rice, picked the best one, and developed a strain that they used and then grew in California, but they sold as wild rice, and it cut into the business and the sustainability of the people in Manitoba and Minnesota and places. So if you buy wild rice ever, make sure you're actually getting wild rice and not something that's grown in California on a huge mechanized farm, and that way you support the local traditions. And ornamental plants such as orchids and cacti are harvested illegally from dwindling populations. So just a note to take care when you're trading or buying things. So those are the conclusions from my part of the presentations. It was historically important among Northwest First Nations, and it still is. And just looking at those biogeoclimatic maps and the dots, you can see that the distribution of a plant on any particular territory kind of gave them a certain trading power. And we still trade today and they serve as an important cultural role. And as things develop in the future, as people do trade and develop new products and commercial development, we really have to be careful how we develop that kind of trade, and that we are doing things sustainably in the manner that people would have done long ago when they depended specifically on the land. You can bet they didn't destroy their systems harvesting food, that they took very good care of them. So I'll hand it over to Phil.
Thank you. So I'm just going to continue on this theme of sustainability and not over-harvesting, and my attraction to this whole topic area, the rationale for it, if you were, is that I think First Nations had it right all along in terms of scaling their resource and land management systems to be such that even if there was extensive harvesting and use, it was never overdone over a large area. So again, we'll keep coming back to the scale issue, and this is in contrast particularly, I've done a lot of work in forestry and forest management, to the very large forest management areas, the very large timber supply areas that our provincial governments and corporations say are sustainably managed, but that could still mean a whole valley being clear cut at a time. And then say, well, no, there's lots of wood over there, you don't have to worry about it. Well, how does that impact the local fisheries and non-timber forest products and recreational users? So having lots of wood over there doesn't really help. So I systematically went about tabulating a number of studies, in fact, that Carla and I both had been involved with over the last 15, 20 years, that really focus on this scale of harvesting and what is the area of land over which we expect things to balance out. Most of them are from the Northwest here, but I'll start with one in the north. In the Northeast, the Fontas River is a tributary of the Fort Nelson River, and is still managed sustainably by a number of Fort Nelson First Nations community members. The context for this, I think, is best set by Hugh Brody's book from, I think, about 1978 or 79, called Maps and Dreams, in which he worked in the Northeast and documented the current use of the licensed trap lines in that country. And whether through good fortune or foresight or insistence on the part of the Treaty 8 people or the Indian agents or the provincial trapline regulators at the time, those trap lines essentially map out as the traditional territories of families that had historically and continued to use that land for all their needs. So even though they'd say, I'm out on the trap line, it really means they're out on the land, and they might be berry picking or moose hunting, not necessarily fur trapping, as you would only in the winter. So the trap line became the term for the territory. Okay. And this continues today. The Fort Nelson First Nation wanted to safeguard, I think it was 5 or 6 trap lines that were being infringed upon by a forest company, and wanted to have our advice on how could the forest company minimize its impact, specifically on a couple of fur bearers, marten and lynx, but also on their main meat source, which was moose. So working with the wildlife biologist, Dale Sipe, and with the trappers themselves, we came up with sort of a semi-quantitative set of rules for what habitat in terms of forest type, deciduous, mixed, or coniferous, and what stage of succession, early, mid, and late, are each of those species most abundant? What is their preferred habitat? And those are what we might call a habitat preference model or habitat suitability model. Here's the one for moose. So you can see they like the deciduous, lots of browse most. The yellow lines are greater than the red or green. And that is most abundant. They like hanging out specifically in the younger forest, 20 to 40 years old. So with that in mind, we could look at the age class structure of the forest. How many hectares are there in each of those 20-year bins of forest type? And due to forest fires that happened some 70 years ago, there's a whole bunch of this land, okay, 50 to 70 years old, and a little bit of old growth. But the harvesting plans by Canadian Forest Products was to hit the big old stands and get them planted into young, vigorously growing plantations again. But from the perspective of looking after the habitat needs of the animals of interest, it's much better to take a lot of this land, which also has commercially sized timber, by the way, and start regenerating it into those early size classes. So save the old growth, which is needed for some species like marten. I didn't show you the habitat distribution there. So more old growth preserved and more young forest for not just the moose, but also the snowshoe hare that the lynx preys upon, right? So going trap line by trap line, house territory by house territory, we were able to come up with adjusted suggestions for how to modify the harvest pattern, that is, what do they target, and rate, so that it would be a sustainable supply of habitat in that area. Moving to the northwest, which example are we going to do first? The Gixan Treaty Office, when it was very active in the 90s, did a lot of work at expanding upon the Gixan model of resource management, which is fundamentally house-based. And the respect for and the efforts to delineate and actively manage all of these individual territories is ongoing today. My good friend and colleague Russell Collier, who has since passed away, is very active in promoting this system, and in fact has written a book about it. So each of those house territories, often modeled around a catchment, a drainage basin, would allow people to be self-sufficient in salmon and in berries and medicinals and in hunted game. They typically have a range of elevations, a range of habitat types, but all in close proximity to each other. Today's version or life for this this approach, if you look online, is called is epitomized by the Susquehanna Sustainability Project. And we did a little bit of research specifically in the Susquehanna River Basin area just before it joins the Bulkley. And if I'm not mistaken, there might even be a blockade there today in which some of the Gixan people are objecting to forest company and pipeline development in the area. So for this particular project, berries were our focus. Again, an ethnobotanical resource. Carla covered some of that, important as food, as trade, a lot of traditional ecological knowledge and culture around the management and use of different berry species. But from an ecological perspective, they're also an important resource for wildlife, especially bears. There's an incredible abundance and diversity in our forests, widespread use, subsistence, recreational berry picking, but also some cash trade going on. And also, as per that example with the Wilpsamai Harvesting Cooperative, there's at least some potential for economic activity as well. So we're talking about things such as Saskatoons, soapberry, pincherry and chokecherry, but especially the black huckleberry, again in Gixan territory and in the mountainous areas. This is the true berry, Simmai. Okay. So this project involved interviewing a couple dozen people who are still active out on the land. Where did they go picking? When did they go picking? What were you picking? Were the yields low, medium, and high? And basically allowed us to document the full range of habitats used in the Susquehanna drainage area. And you can see it's divided by the different house groups here. That's what the purple lines mean. Gieth, Galdog. I can't read that one. I can't remember it either. And from that, we also, slides are slightly out of order here. We had another research project in which we documented the berry yields as a function of shade, the amount of light availability. I thought there was another habitat supply function. Anyway, based on the distribution of these berry patches, we could say that, okay, at medium elevations and on south-facing slopes first and north-facing slopes later in the seasons, these berries would come on. But the key restriction for a lot of those berry patches is shading, the development of the forest through succession over time. General feeling is that maximum yields are held in full sunlight or something slightly less than full sunlight. So once the trees start growing back after a fire or clear cutting, then the berries are shaded out. So ironically enough, a lot of berry picking was done in these purple squares, which are cut blocks, and they would be good berry patches for 5 or 10 years, and then they'd grow over. But historically, good berry patches were in old burns. That is, that the sky was opened up by fire. So the key to managing them is to, again, keep overhead shading to a minimum, whether that's by brushing or perhaps a greater use of fire. We did some simulation modeling, which played with another variable in forestry, which is known as stalking. How many stems per hectare, SPH, do you plant trees to? The standard for much of north central BC is that, you always plant to at least 1,200, maybe 2,000 stems per hectare. But the denser you plant things, the sooner they shade out other species. So by switching from 2,000 to 400 stems per hectare, we could extend the time of sufficient light availability at the forest floor by 10 years. So we came up with a matrix of suggested alternatives depending on the zone and priority in which forest companies were operating and the First Nations input as to whether it was just enough to minimize data damage, maintain existing levels, or enhance berry production. And there are various steps that could be taken in harvesting, in terms of reducing impact, and in silviculture, or the management of the stand. Obviously you would avoid herbicides. and then controlling their densities and spacings and cutting back competing species, or even nurturing, that is culturing, more berry growth by prescribed burning and cutting, especially off of the timber harvest land base. And this is, again, a land management concept that is often not considered when we hear protests about industrial forestry or conflicts with First Nations values. And that is that zoning can do a lot to reduce conflict, even though in theory all of the bulkly timber supply area might be up for grabs by the sawmills. In fact, only the relatively low elevation and accessible areas marked in red here will ever be harvested. The other areas just aren't operable in terms of the access or the size of trees. So the more we can enhance berry production at the fringes into these yellow areas, the less conflict we have. Another suggestion, and this was the impetus behind the Wilpsami Harvesting Cooperative, is that often to be taken seriously or have a seat at the table in these discussions, you have to bring the economic factor to bear. This is much more prominent in Scandinavia. This shows a berry buying station in Finland, just like we have mushroom depots here. And people were picking wild lingonberry and wild blueberry for canning and distribution into restaurants, and sold in every grocery store. Wild lingonberries, wild blueberries. Maybe we should be doing that here. The third case study builds on Carla's example with Devil's Club. And in fact, this was a chapter from her thesis too. She talked about its importance. And here the people of the Nass were concerned about population loss and habitat loss due to clear cutting. We typically are used to seeing Devil's Club in old growth forest, in nice shaded environments. So we undertook a research project to document, well, in clear cuts, does Devil's Club come back? And if so, under what conditions? And there's a tremendous amount of variation over time. The size of Devil's Club in terms of diameter and height does gradually increase over time. But what's just as important is that some of these stands that were disturbed even 11 years ago were doing quite fine. And so here's a Devil's Club growing very, very, very well out in the open. Thank you very much. And the key seems to be other factors. If slash burning was used, or if you were looking where big burn piles had been, then Devil's Club really was hit back. It does not survive fire well. And there were some other things we found, such as if there's too much competition, it doesn't do well, but it does benefit from some shade, so preferably dead shade like slash and log piles. And so some very practical recommendations came out of that little study to protect existing Devil's Club populations, situate them in wildlife tree patches, which would have other values for set aside as well. Scattered slash could provide protection, and avoid burn piles and slash burning. I also have a theory yet to be developed that you can get away with clear cutting and Devil's Club management on the coast where there's a lot of cloud, so that's sort of like shade, whereas the more you go into the interior, around Prince George or down towards Williams Lake, where you still have Devil's Club, but the skies are more cloud-free and they get burned up a little bit more. So there is a link to climate here that needs to be sorted out yet. We could talk about many other examples. Pine mushrooms, an important non-timber resource, even if not a traditional resource. You can likewise develop a yield curve, habitat suitability model, if you like, for their response to different stages and types of forests. And again, lots of opportunities for developing these non-timber forest products, not just 2x4s if we wanted to. It's been argued that many of the dryish, even-aged pine and hemlock stands around here over any one 60-year period, which is about the minimum you can expect to harvest, to plant and harvest a new stand of trees for lumber, will yield something like 10 times its value in pine mushrooms than in timber. So the key is to identify those sites and let them do their thing. So some generalizations. from this work is that traditional land management systems over small scales are a useful template for multiple values, but they need a supportive policy framework, and even then, sort of any one management approach will probably not suit all of those values at play. In people advocating for non-timber forest products and traditional practices, you have to be assertive but still speak the same language as foresters or those who are currently in charge of the land management system. You have to talk about yield curves and rotations and retention and stocking. It's just the jargon that goes with the trade. In many cases, we can redirect logging or the non-timber activities to areas where they don't conflict. So that strategic approach can reduce conflict through zoning. Sometimes partial cutting, variable retention, flexible stocking and brushing can help, same as using or avoiding fire as appropriate for different species. So you'll notice fire is useful for huckleberry, but damaging to devil's club, right? So you have to know when and where to use which. And there are many examples of these sorts of systems around the world. Indonesia, Africa, Hawaii has what's called its Ahupua'a Waiahole approach, which essentially means for this watershed from mountain peak down to the coral reef, all of the needs of a family, a clan are met, from timber and bird feathers through to wild foods, through to cultivated taro gardens, through to the fish on the reef. And all of the islands are divided up into these similar territories, much like the Gixan do. Now, obviously, there are sociocultural as well as ecological benefits. If you look at dividing the landscape into many small pieces, each with their own independent management style that contributes to what many researchers are now calling resilience through complex adaptive systems, a hot topic these days. The one problem that I foresee is that large-scale disturbances then become a greater threat. Okay, what if a fire burns out a whole Gixan house territory? What if the mountain pine beetle comes along and destroys the entire wood supply on a community or First Nations forest tenure? Well, the answer, of course, is back to the earlier presentation. You have to have good relationships with your neighbors and be able to trade to get you through those tough times and those periods of scarcity. So most traditional subsistence-based societies obtain necessities over relatively small areas. Trade existed to fill the gaps. A good model for local sustainable forest management. Trade has always been there, part of the globalized economy today. One need for future research, I think, is really to document the extent to which people, especially in our rural and remote communities, still depend on these subsistence activities and how much they trade them either for cash or other resources. Certainly worth studying. And ethnobiology, ethnobotany is not just that intersection of linguistics and history. It's involved with so many other things: history, medicine, law, religion, cuisine, culture, geography. And this really reflects the work of dozens of people. Thank you for your time today. If you have any questions for Carla, maybe ask her first, as her next lecture starts in 3 minutes.
I have one, unless you had something to say first.
No?
Carla, you want to stand in the cone of activity here, so live on stream?
Okay.
Apparently, we have 11 people online, so it's nice to have to
I'm
reach
very
out.
interested in the Haida potato.
Uh-huh.
And it's my understanding, just growing up here and hearing the local voices, that the Haida people were growing that before Europeans arrived on the coast, and that it in fact came from Hawaii. And I'm wondering if you've recorded that or found any evidence of that, or how it might have come.
Yeah, I in my paper I took a little bit of exception to some information I read that the Haida called it skuseed, and it was a name, and that it was because that's what they were trying to say, good seed in the English language. And I thought, wow, that sounds a little ridiculous to me. So I contacted a linguistic friend, and she said, no, and then gave the interpretation that it was from something else, which were some of the names I was trying to connect for you. I didn't see it as coming from Hawaii, but maybe from, you know, South America and coming down the coast. But it's possible, certainly. It was a really neat paper to go and try and document the path of the potato from South America and then back to Europe and then all down, and the importance that it had for people. So.
And with the lack of carbohydrates in a Pacific Rim diet, was it a highly valued, often traded
yes,
product?
for sure it was, yeah. It would have been very highly valued. And the other thing that's pretty interesting about it, there wasn't like just one potato. There were all kinds of different potatoes, and some would grow well in one area and some in another. So it was like a highly developed plant production and you know, incredible knowledge over hundreds of years that went into the growing and the trading of the potato. And I'd really like to see the people who were responsible for getting it, growing it, and trading it get credit for that. Right?
Mhm. Yeah, thank you.
One thing I would add to that question is it's well known that for decades in the 1800s, the Haida were the growers of potatoes for the coast and for the Hudson's Bay Company. It's like they just took off with, you know, the European version apparently, and that was a big subject of trade with the Tsimshan and the Tlingit and perhaps even further afield. When it comes to Hawaii, the Hawaiian Islands were discovered about the same time as the first ships appeared on a Haida Gwaii. You know, 1782 or so, I think was Cook's date. So the Hawaiians would have had the sweet potato, but I've never heard of them having the Inca South American potato.
I think that is the sweet potato that I had read about as well. I have to actually go, so maybe Phil can answer the questions for you. So.
I was curious about the Quechua, Korongo. Quechua.
Oh, yeah.
What's this Korongo? What did that mean? Was it a
What
language name?
was their word for potatoes?
No. He means the subgroup of the Quechuan language. So the Quechua is the Inca language, right?
Yes.
So the Korongo group was sort of more the northern end, around Ecuador, rather than the Lima classical Quechua.
Gotcha.
Yes, David.
First Nations tend to be better at sustainable harvesting than we are. And I noticed that the Devil's Club is harvested. It's a ginseng relative.
Mm-hmm.
And so is another forest plant growing in the same region, wild sarsaparilla.
Okay.
Where if you pick a wild sarsaparilla, you've taken the whole plant out of the ground. Whereas if you harvest just the selected root bark of Devil's Club, you leave the whole plant. How much more examples like that are there in First Nations harvesting that makes more sense than we would do it?
Yeah, I mean, one of the obvious ones is the collection of cedar planks. I mean, you know, many of the large plank houses had an example of a single plank being taken with wedges from a living tree, and the tree would keep growing on. I think that would be an interesting study to systematically compare, you know, harvesting patterns and alternatives. In most cases, when people harvest Devil's Club roots, they do end up digging up, you know, a good chunk of the plant, and it may or may not recover. But if you harvest the stems and are looking after the inner bark, it's well known for its resprouting ability. There's no problem there whatsoever. Yeah, anything in which you take the root is more fatal than if you take the above ground portion.
Yeah, the wild sarsaparilla is the entire root. You can't take just a little bit.
Yeah. But I haven't heard about traditional harvesting of wild sarsaparilla roots. Does anybody know about that? That's not something I've encountered in the Northwest.
They used to use it as an energy source for long treks. I read in which book it was, BC government
Okay.
book. There's some on Ferry Island.
Oh, yeah.
In the Devil's Club regions.
Yeah, I know the plant. Good. Any chat online there, Alex?
Nothing online.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay.